in the next 45 minutes, I want to kind of explain to you why we believe and hopefully make the pitch for why this is a system that helps us describe what we actually observe in terms of human behavior and institutional behavior, and how it can help us figure out how to solve any of the problems we might have with our behaviors, in particular how our behavior affects the environment. If you are collaborating with economists in the US particularly, but also almost anywhere, you need to know where we're coming from. And that's really what we can debate where we're coming from later. This is about helping you understand why we're coming from where we're coming from. I kind of started with the same thing. It's always interesting, what do we actually disagree about? And Pete's already said, yeah, of course we disagree about stuff. We've talked about the discount rate issue. We're going to talk in the next couple days about a couple of other kind of key issues. But in general, one of the things you've been hearing from this group is that in terms of the basic stuff, the important stuff, we actually don't disagree that much. And so that may be disturbing to you. But I think you should also it gives you pause. Like, why do they all have this fundamental belief? It is a shared paradigm, not that it's static. It's been developing for 100 years or more. It evolves in the data we have access to, the methods we use, the actual problems we're focused on. But the foundations that I'm going to give you a quick refresher course in are remarkably resistant to internal critique, at least. So with that, what are the foundations? Foundation one, these kind of parallel what Pete described already. Self-interest as the key human and institutional impulse. That is, we try to do what we perceive to be better for ourselves, or as an institution, do what's better for our institutions, for our households. It's almost like a biological imperative. You can view it analogous to that. And we can talk about this later, but we can look around our own lives and probably see some echo of that kind of thing. Rationality, we've talked a little bit about this. Again, this is so inherent to how economists think that we may not do a great job of, like, what is rationality? It's like, duh. Well, we're all rational, right? So you can translate it in kind of day-to-day terms as more is better. Things we like, more is better. Things we don't like, less is better. That's rational. We already talked about this transitivity property. That's sometimes important. It's not necessarily much more than that. And then kind of fundamental to how we go about thinking about problems and then actually solving them is to think about, we think about maximization. When you combine self-interest and rationality, it creates this kind of impulse to maximize, do the best you can as an economy, as a society, as a firm, as a household. And then maximization is subject to all kinds of constraints. And so we talk a lot about constraints, information constraints, time constraints, resource constraints, labor constraints. But that's basically what we're up to. Now, we've already handled this. Are we always self-interested? No. Are we always rational? No. Do we always maximize? No. Okay. So, however, we think, and not only do we think, but we tend to find, as we look at data about human behavior and institutional behavior, that self-interest and rationality and this maximization impulse tends to describe, predict a lot of what we see in the world. So there are definitely exceptions, and we can talk about that. We've touched on some of this. Sometimes this is important to emphasize. Economics is not just about making money for companies. It's not just about profits and wages and things we typically trade in markets and put dollar values on. We think about beauty. How does beauty affect our well-being? Now, is it easy to put a value on that? No, but we all know that beauty is valuable, and therefore it's important to economics because it's important to people. Do we care about the stewardship of our planet? Yes, many of us do, most of us do. Acting in a way that promotes that stewardship is clearly valuable to people, and so economics cares about it because humans care about it. So don't just think about, again, buying and selling stuff. It's about anything that matters to our well-being. We're the dismal science. You've probably heard us described that way. We're probably cynical / pragmatic as human beings. We self-select into this profession because, well, maybe we're not as aspirational as others of you. We tend to think that the scientific approach is let's look at how people actually behave rather than how we want them to behave. And if we want them to behave differently, we have to do something about that. You already heard from Pete, there's no free lunch. Every choice involves a trade-off, and almost every choice is constrained somehow. And that at a level of deep philosophy, the thing we're seeking is to do the best for society or whatever unit we're thinking about. And so that's anthropocentric. The goal and the objective we're heading toward is what's best for people. And for many of you, from an environmental perspective, that can seem odd. And I think, again, we can debate this later on, but that anthropocentric perspective is the worst perspective except for all the others, is how we would put it. Economics does take equity, fairness, distribution of costs and benefits seriously. We can help measure who gains and who loses. We do that a lot. We know that it's important, ethically important, politically important, et cetera. But what we tend to gravitate more to is this efficient, the welfare maximizing solution. And we feel equipped to kind of define what that is. Again, it's the most good for the greatest number, in a way. If you start talking about, and we can be prescriptive about that, when it starts getting to prescriptive questions about what is fair, that's a lot murkier. And again, we sort of leave that to the philosophers and the politicians to a certain extent. We can help talk about how you can redistribute income and, again, who gains and loses. But we tend to have a much more agnostic view of the fair solution because that's just, to us, a murkier concept. You've heard of a demand curve. All it's going to be used to generate this are these assumptions, again, that you all, I'm going to assume you guys have a demand for something, that you could come up with, if we were doing a negotiation or you were bidding on it, you could think about how much that actually is worth to you. And then where you get a demand curve from is basically it maps that value you place on things to, again, using rationality, what you're actually willing to pay for it and what the price is. And so if we had time to do this, I would have gone around and asked everyone, I've got a bag of candy bars, and tell me what that bag of candy bars is worth to you. We would have generated data from the room. And I'd then order this data from the person who valued it the most to the person who valued it the least. And all you're doing is creating a vision of that ordering. Okay? That's all a demand function is. And it could be for a group. You could have your own demand function for how many beers you want this week. The first beer really matters, and then maybe the 10th beer I don't want as much. And again, you can draw these quote-unquote demand curves. And so the first prediction, that tells you something right there, that's a data exercise. So someone like Sheila is trying at times to actually construct these demand curves using behavior and other kinds of signals in the outside world. And prediction one, if that was actually what the curve looked like, if we asked you all, if the price of candy bars is 50 cents, all this is showing is that 10 of you would rationally pay 50 cents and get those 10 candy bars. That's all it is, okay? There's a little bit of rationality there. There's the idea that you can actually map your well-being into candy bars, and that gets you prediction number 1. You can also think about that as benefits. It's capturing something about the benefits of candy bars. Supply. Supply is about costs. What does it cost to actually produce something? So now think about being the company, the factory, the firm that's producing candy bars. There's a price that you can get for that candy bar that will lead you to want to produce it. And that's a function of how much it costs you to produce it. Okay? So again, you're self-interested and rational as the company. Do I actually want to produce these candy bars? Okay? So this shape, this function, is just describing how the number of candy bars translates into the cost of producing them. So you get a second prediction. This is just 1 point. If the price of candy bars, and we're going to talk about where the price comes from in a second, if it's 30 cents, you'll get 7 of these being produced by 1 or more companies. You wouldn't produce more because the cost of doing so is less than you're getting back as the company. So it's just this basic self-interest and rationality story again. Okay. Now what happens now? Okay, we kind of mapped out this depiction of benefits. We've mapped out this depiction of costs. We've talked about how behavior changes as this price is moving. And now we can go further. We can actually say, well, what price do we think is going to emerge given rational self-interest here? So imagine the world is at this price, 30 cents. You get 7 of these candy bars being made, and people still love all that candy, okay? So imagine competition. So what about can we get the price? We can actually charge these people a lot more than 30 cents because it's worth that much more to them. So maybe we can move further out this curve. It's still better for the consumers to have more candy bars, and the companies that are producing them still see this benefit in terms of it's more than their costs. So in effect, what happens is you get, this is a concept important to us as well, an equilibrium. You get this set of behaviors that leads the price to be the one that equates that marginal demand for the next candy bar to the marginal cost of that candy bar. And any price above or below, you're going to get this mismatch between what people want and what people are willing to supply. You get these competitive juices flowing. And that kind of pushes you to this point. Now, why would you not go beyond that point? Heather,
Demand is too low.
Which you can describe as people aren't willing to pay what it costs to produce the thing. Yeah. So prediction number 3 here, and all we're getting this from is we have these 2 shapes, this one, and this rationality thing going on. And if we can measure those shapes, we can actually predict the price that will appear in the market and the amount that will be demanded in the market and produced in the market. Okay. This is, in a way, another lesson here is this is Adam Smith. You've heard about the invisible hand. This is kind of a crude way of depicting all that's going on here is you have individual rationality and self-maximization, and yet in aggregate, this market produces exactly what we want it to produce, which is up to the point where the costs do not exceed the benefits of this production. We find this works. You looked at data, it's simple, it's got some behavioral assumptions. It does have some matters of philosophy, and in what we look around the world, this actually describes behavior pretty well. And so as scientists, we don't have a problem with it. Here's another thing you can use this very simple diagram. These just shapes moving in and out. So here's something we would care about as environmentalists. The demand for beef is increasing throughout Asia, for example. People are getting wealthier. They want more cows. That's going to have problems for land use, et cetera. That's visually depicted and algebraically depicted as that curve is shifting out. If you had that same line here, that leads to a prediction of what happens to prices and the amount actually produced. So a lot of economists think about what moves demand curves up and down and what changes their shapes. Someone mentioned elasticity. Elasticity is kind of the amount a quantity changes for a given change in price, and that's all about the shape of this thing. And again, it will have predictive implications. Similarly, on the supply side, what makes costs go down? Innovation. So again, almost the invisible hand, the churning of people competing with one another. We can produce memory, computer memory, much cheaper than we used to. So that shifts the cost curve down. It generally leads to lower prices, more demand, that kind of thing. These curves can take on strange shapes. The learning by doing thing, that the more units you produce, the cheaper things become. That can lead to a declining shape of that supply curve. And so you're kind of, again, in this very simple way, that you've got this visualization of how these things that are going on out there, like how technology changes or how people's desire for beef is changing, are moving these shapes around that's leading us to be able to predict behavior differently. Okay, another shape. Like you hear this theme, I'm talking about shapes here. This is another shape that's important. We do tend to think about curvature as in our math. This is an important one. Basically, that there's in our terminology, there's a declining marginal utility of income. The richer you get, the less your well-being improves for that additional dollar. Now, interestingly, you need that shape to generate a demand for insurance. Otherwise, why buy insurance? And one of the reasons is that it helps you kind of smooth that curve out. A bit more about our math. So I've described this as shapes, and I'm a visual learner. The key for me in economics was being able to draw pictures, but every picture has either numerical or algebraic representation. And one thing is that we do a lot of topology. We don't necessarily talk about ourselves doing topology, but again, thinking about what shapes look like, how it's like set theory and tangencies are important. Again, we don't have time to go into this. But a question I would be very interested in hearing is whether topology is used in any biophysical models, biological models, to describe the behavior of biotic species, for example. I want to highlight Lagrangian methods. So Lagrange lived sometime, you guys know, a long time ago, or fairly long. Anyway, he came up with the math that it basically lets you find a maximum. So here's this idea of maximization again. You got multiple variables. Here it's just x and y. You've got a function of two variables that has a maximum. It's the peak of that hill there. And so first of all, you see the kind of maximization math, and then the other thing is maximization subject to a constraint. So we could think about, I want to jointly maximize my labor inputs and my time inputs, I mean my capital inputs, but I have some other kind of constraint, and so what's the best I can do, the most maximum thing I can do subject to some other constraint? That's the math he basically helped us with. And then, this is the last thing I'll say on this, you can look at sort of the effect of relaxing the constraint or tightening the constraint on that maximum, and we use this kind of thing, or I used to anyway, I don't anymore. Couple other things about math. Some of us use what's called optimal control theory. Basically, this is intertemporal dynamic optimization. It requires a different set of mathematical tools. And then game theory, which I'll go through a couple of examples here in a minute. But again, in all of these, it's math that's being used to depict incentives, maximization, and constraints, kind of our core concepts. This came up earlier about our empirical, and I just wanted to point this out. It goes to Margaret's question, and I do think it's important that the ability for you all to engage, for example, in why economics seems bogus to you or what problems you have with economics, that's because you are economic agents yourself, and you have your own intuition. It's much harder for me to say, you know, you biologists are full of it, because I just don't have, you know, as much daily intuition about what's happening in biology. So how do you respond to wages? How would you respond to rent control in your building? My friend David, he would kill me if he knew I was putting his picture up right now, but I'm using him as an example. And this is about kind of how economics adapts and confronts the intuition we have in our daily lives. So I showed you that demand curve. You know, the price, as the price falls, you get more and more demand. And I'm explaining this to my friend David, who's not an economist, one day, and he's like, no, when prices go up, I demand more. And I was like, what the hell are you talking about? Why would he say that? Yeah?
He thinks that something is better because it costs more?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah. So what do economists do? We're like, yeah, that's a good point. Let's develop theory that would explain exactly that kind of thing. And so there's this, again, this happens over and over in economics, is sometimes those basic intuitions we all have, again, you had an intuition about that, he had an intuition about that, that prompts us to revisit our theory. And so some very smart people published this, and it's basically showing the conditions under which a high price you could use as a signal of the quality of a product that would lead you to want it more. Overall, we still believe in demand curves as I showed them, but there are also exceptions. And again, we try to absorb that kind of intuition into the canon, if you will. Okay, market failure. That very quick supply and demand thing, we get to the efficient outcome, is obviously often wrong. And one of the reasons it's wrong is these markets and the behaviors we described can lead us to problematic outcomes. And so one thing would be monopoly power. Well, we're not going to talk about that. Another thing we've already talked about is this concept of externalities, and then public goods, as Margaret teed up before. So what we do, all of us do this in the economics of public policy, is we're trying to use our analysis to define what the optimal outcome is, the one that maximizes welfare. Ask, does the invisible hand or do markets and self-interested behavior actually lead to that efficient outcome? And if not, then what do we do? And so that's really what Sheila, Pete, and I spend our lives doing. So it's going to be this kind of prescriptive, what should we do? All right, I already talked about that. So I'm going back to this candy bars example. Here's your crash course on externalities. This is what it costs to make the candy bars. What if candy bars produces pollution cost X? Something about the nougat, you know, is bad. And so using our shapes again, our visualization here, we get a problem. So if this is the actual cost, but this is the cost that the company bears, you're gonna get this outcome again. You're gonna get this number of candy bars actually produced and consumed in the economy. But it's producing this external cost. And that means that for all of these units, the cost of the candy bars is more than the benefits they're providing society. So what you really want is to somehow get back to this point. And so you can think about this as the loss to society of having that externality actually exist. And so what do we do about that? There's several things. One, this is a reason we have what we call environmental liability law. So if you pollute, you pay for your pollution. That leads to an internalization of those costs, and it means that the firm actually now would start behaving as if because these are the costs that will be imposed on it. And so it leads them to actually internalize those social costs. Same thing with environmental taxation. We could just impose a per unit candy bar tax that equals the pollution cost. Another strategy that's different is we could actually set some kind of technology standard. We're going to force companies to, in effect, put nougat scrubbers in, and so the nougat won't be causing a problem, which would completely eliminate the external cost. Or we could somehow cap, and this is what we see in the climate arena, cap the total amount of pollution at the optimal level or something lower than would occur otherwise. So in a way, we're using this kind of market failure, our understanding of the costs created by it, creating a motivation to intervene in the market to solve this kind of market problem. The second example that comes up a lot here is public goods. So public goods are things that we share. A lot of what we're talking about at the sink or in your environmental contexts, you can describe as public goods: the oceans, wild nature, species, existence, that kind of thing. And these are things that are, when we consume them, we don't actually reduce the amount consumed by others. That's kind of the defining property. And we can get problems here too. So I don't know if you saw the movie A Beautiful Mind, but John Nash, the guy on the left, is that his name? Yeah. He lived a troubled life, but he was a genius, and he developed the mathematics that we use today to describe what's called game theory. And it's literally like a game. It's like playing chess. Often we behave rationally and with self-interest in the following way. How should I act given how I think you're going to act? It's like poker. It's like business. Then there's Eleanor Ostrom on the right, and so she applies some of these, or addresses some of these issues in terms of games and cooperation related to environmental issues. And again, it's getting at a similar question, like how do I behave given how I think you're going to behave, and vice versa. And then how do groups of people and institutions form to deal with that kind of thing? Okay, so these are canned examples. I have two of them, and then I'm basically done. So stick with me here. So I'm going to do a public good example and then a commons example here. So here are the numbers I'm going to throw at you. So imagine there's only two of us. We live on a river, and it costs $4 to keep the river clean. And you and I can either individually pay that $4 cost, or we can share it to each. And having the river clean is worth $3 to each of us. So again, step one for the economist is it optimal to clean the river? Is it?
Yes.
Why?
Because it's worth $3 to each of you, so it's $6. And it would only cost $2 each of you.
Thank you very much. Yeah. Okay. Now, is that what's going to happen, though? So that's our optimal. Now we want to say, if people are self-interested and rational, are we going to get that optimal outcome? And now here, this is a game theory matrix, and I know I'm throwing a lot at you, but what it's doing is it's saying you have a choice. Are you going to kick in to clean up the river or not? Or am I going to do that? And then are you going to do that? And then it kind of maps out, given those two strategies of yours and two strategies of mine, what the kind of individual profit from that choice is going to be. So if we both pay, we each pay $2 and we each get $3 in benefit. That leaves us $1 each. However, if I free ride and I don't pay and you pay, you're bearing the whole cost, $4, and only getting the $3 benefit. So you're in the hole. And I get the full $3 benefit to myself. And then you kind of just flip it, and if neither of us pay, nothing gets clean, we don't bear a cost. So the first thing to see here is you can see the optimal thing is definitely to clean the river rather than not clean the river. So these all add up to 2 rather than 0. And now what you do is you kind of use this matrix to think about your optimal choice. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to say, what's it optimal for me to do given that you pay for the clean water? Okay. So if you pay for the clean water, what's bigger, 1 or 3? To me, it's better that I don't pay. Okay, so what if you don't pay? What's better for me? Well, actually, it's better for me also to not pay. So I have a dominant game strategy here to not pay. And because this is symmetric, you have the same dominant strategy to not pay, and so nobody pays, and it's bad. Okay, so this is, again, a very toy baby version of what we call the public good problem, using game theory to look at it, and free riding behavior and that kind of thing. And it's an argument for public intervention. So anything that's a public good, there's actually an economic rationale for forcing people to pay their share. So we do that for national defense. We do it for a lot of environmental goods, not all of them, of course, for security, things like that. Because if we didn't, people would shirk and free ride, and you wouldn't get what you wanted. Okay. The final example is kind of the flip side of this. And I'm going to generate this example using these cow numbers. Okay. So bear with me if you would. If you and I, the choice here is you and I can each own 1 cow or 2 cows each. And then there's some mapping of the total number of cows into the total value of cows. Now, for the ecologists in the room, how could it be that twice as many cows leads to less total value?
The skinny cows?
Sorry, what?
The skinny cows?
Yeah. Why? Okay, why? Because
Scarce resources.
Yeah. So again, this is kind of this commons issue. You're basically overgrazing leads to this biological deficit. So that's just an explanation of why these numbers might be plausible. Okay. So again, a simple toy example, and you get a similar kind of game matrix here. And all that's going on here is each extra cow gives the cow owner, the owner of that cow, $3 more benefit. But there's this grazing cost of $4 that's shared between the two of them. And so it's that sharing of the cost, but not the sharing of the benefit, that leads to this similar kind of problem. In effect, I'm externalizing part of the grazing cost if I add another cow to the other person. And so you can construct a similar game matrix here, and the result is that both have an incentive to have 2 cows, whereas it would be better if they both withheld and only had 1. So, bottom line here is these public good problems and commons problems exist. Economic theory, this kind of idea that rationality and self-interest can predict these things, combined with the mathematics of game theory, are a kind of key tool that we use in our discipline. Then it yields these kind of policy prescriptions for what are we going to do. So in this case, one of the remedies would be, let's privatize ownership of that land. Let's not have it be a commons. And that now gets at a fairness and a political question. It can sound bad to privatize. It can sound like land grabbing if you privatize. And yet private ownership in the land can lead to incentives that lead you to not overgraze as much. You can be a government and you can come in and say, nope, you just can't have any more than 2 cows. It's the heavy hand of government, but leads to the right outcome. Or you can do what Eleanor Ostrom did and look at how cultures and communities actually informally, that is without government, achieve social cooperation. And that's why she won the Nobel Prize, is to kind of think about how, because there's such a social imperative to solve that problem, you don't necessarily need government to actually come in and do it. Overall, though, the basic tenets of neoclassical economics, we believe, self-interest, rationality, maximizing impulse, they yield robust predictions. You can look at the world and actually see this occurring. And then it helps us with these kind of institutional prescriptions of what to do about those problems when we see them.